Welcome to the Becoming a Streamer podcast by Pipeline, where we interview your favorite streamers and learn about their journey to where they are today. I'm your host and co-founder of Pipeline, Snoopy. Today, I'm joined by JP. He's one of the most legendary interviewers in eSports, and he's now being interviewed himself. JP goes into his story, which is a trip down memory lane when he was a broke college student doing odd jobs trying to get a foot in the industry, to turning down a job at Major League Gaming, to now having one of the most popular roleplay shows on Twitch. He's now got over 350,000 followers, and I think you're absolutely gonna love this one. If you like it, please do us a favor and share it with a friend. I had a lot of flashbacks to over 7 years ago when the tables were turned and it was actually you interviewing me.
Yeah. Was it? It's not. Has it really been 7 years?
I went back and checked, and it was January 2013.
Man.
So it was a long time ago, and I actually had a Scottish accent, whereas now I don't.
You know, I didn't consider that till you just said that. You definitely had a thicker accent back then.
Yeah, my wife.
You spent too much time here, sir.
I know, seriously. It's the one thing that my wife gives me the most stick about is my accent. She's from England, and she's like, "Oh, I wish you had a Scottish accent." You know, I married a Scotsman and didn't even get the Scottish accent.
It's true. It's true. Yeah, you'll go back. Maybe you go back on a vacation. It'll come back. I'm from Texas. I don't sound Texan at all, from what I've been told. So
yeah, I can't.
But every time I do go home, there's a little bit of Texan that comes out. Little twang, I guess, is what I've been told.
Is your vocabulary changed? Do you ever bring up certain Texan words?
I say y'all a lot.
Yeah.
That's pretty much ingrained in everything that I say. I don't know if I have any other Texas words. I know that living in the Midwest for the past 2 years here in St. Louis, I'll say Hoosier. You know what Hoosier is?
I have no idea what Hoosier is.
Hoosier is like the Midwest version of redneck, I think. So it's slightly derogatory and slightly country, but it's not like Texas country. It's like
is it polite country?
Maybe. I'm trying to skirt around what the definitive words would be. I would go more like meth country. Might be a way to discern that a little bit better.
Oh, well, I love it. Yeah. Anyway, it's just really funny just looking back, but I want to jump in and talk about your story.
Sure.
On this podcast, we have a lot of listeners that are just starting out on their journey, and they really love to hear how you got to where you are today. So I wanted to wind the clock way back to where you grew up and, how you started getting into content creation. In those very initial days, were you a viewer? How did it start off?
I'm not necessarily sure if there was a tried and true catalyst for anything. I do remember back during the days, I grew up playing video games, as I think kind of most people in this industry have. And I got into going to LAN parties back in the day. QuakeCon was the biggest one in Texas, and still I think might be the biggest LAN event in Texas. And I would go there. I was going there from 2007 or 8 for people that visit QuakeCon or have ever been. It was back when they were in Mesquite, Texas, at a hotel there, not at the Gaylord Hotel, but at a different hotel.
I have so many questions, but I'm just gonna let it slide.
The Gaylord Hotel is giant. If you're ever interested in seeing a giant hotel that you wouldn't expect to be called the Gaylord, the Gaylord Dallas, no. The Gaylord in Grapevine is where it's at. It's huge. There's also one in Nashville and one somewhere else. They're massive complexes. They're just stupid huge. They have a giant atrium. They're super ritzy.
Oh,
one of the nicer hotels I've ever stayed in. But I started going to QuakeCon back in the day, and I want to say DJ Wheat might have been there. I didn't know him at the time, and I don't remember him at the time, but there was definitely the beginnings of shoutcasting that were occurring. And I remember listening to those shows and being kind of interested in those shows, and they were broadcasting Quake 3 at the time. I think they were doing the tournament. It might have been, I think 0-4 and Fatality were the finals, just to say how long ago that was.
Yeah.
But I remember seeing that and thinking, oh, that's cool. That's an interesting thing to see people kind of, be the Madden of a video game. But I didn't really like get into content creation, I think, until sometime later. When I started going to college, I have a journalism degree. And around the time that I started as a freshman in college, I thought that it might be kind of fun to do podcasts. So back then, the first podcast that I ever did was a show for World of Warcraft called ArenaCast. That was myself and some people back then who were on a team by the name of Pandemic, who featured, I don't know if you're going to recognize these names or if anyone in your audience will recognize these names, but Vihel, Kent, Nocton, a couple other, trying to think if there was any other names that kind of branched out into the wide world of esports after that. But
Kungan's like the only like kind of older school one is like Kungan, and I guess these are more
he
newer.
was definitely more PvE focused at the time,
Yeah.
And maybe like for all time, I think he's maybe been more PvE focused. But
was Carlos was Ocelot competing then?
I don't know. Ocelot maybe might have been, and he was definitely in the European world, but it was at a tournament called the World Series of Video Games, which was a subsidiary of CBS, I think, way back when. And that's kind of how I got started out. Was I started doing that podcast called ArenaCast. We had some viewers that were working at Gotfrag at the time. And then Gotfrag, of course, was kind of like they were like the ESPN of esports at the time. And so I started working for them, and I was more of a score grunt. What that entails in sense of, I was a guy that was up at 3 or 4 a.m. U.S. time because there was tournaments happening somewhere in the world, and so someone had to input the scores from those CS matches into the back end so that people that were wanting those scores in a live situation would get them. So I was the guy that was up at 3 or 4 a.m. doing that. So I definitely like
putting in your legwork for the industry, right there.
I definitely did, and it was all unpaid. It was all volunteer work, and it was for a very long time. But at the time of doing that, I was doing kind of the score input, the score grunt work, while also doing podcasts.
Can I ask a question? What motivated you to start that podcast? Because you said you're a fan, you were kind of on the surface of the industry, you were looking at it and kind of participating. But why did you go start the podcast? What made you take that step?
I think it was honestly just like me trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was lucky enough that there wasn't that many people kind of in the game at that point. And there was so little coverage on World of Warcraft PvP, like in the arena, like 3v3 style PvP. So I kind of just was able to, meet those people and talk to those people, and eventually got enough weight to my name where people were just more welcoming to come on the show. But in terms of like what started it all, it was more just like me finding out what I enjoyed. And I think after, 10 or 13 years now later, I think I was honestly I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy hearing their, opinions on things, and interviewing people like you're doing here and like I did with you 7 years ago, as you said. I'm just interested in other people's stories. And I think that's kind of what's driven me for a large part of what I've done in the industry thus far.
Would you say your focus in the early days was on the podcasting interview style? Like, was that how you built your identity in the early days, by interviewing others, or how did that evolve?
I think so. Yeah. I never had ambitions of being kind of a play-by-play or a shoutcaster like I was for StarCraft 2. That was just something that kind of happened out of necessity, I guess, in terms of actually having a job. I've always been more interested in just talking with people and creating shows around that type of idea, or interviewing people around that type of idea. Because I've always felt that, at least back then, it definitely was true that not a lot of people were interested in kind of the storylines around what was happening in the space. And I think that's at the core of everything. That was the most important aspect, and kind of always is the most important aspect of any sport is, what are the storylines? Why is this match interesting? Why does player A and player B hate each other? Why do they not? Why do they hang out so often? Like, what are those storylines? Why is this interesting? And I was always more privy to just trying to find that than I was being the guy that would be kind of the play-by-play guy, or now more just like being the guy that entertains by playing games. So I think that's kind of why I started in that direction.
Do you think there was anything to do with your degree in journalism that led you to go down the path of interviewing people versus, say, it was in like video or something and going down that more creative path of creating different content?
I think it definitely helped. I've always found people say that I'm good at interviewing, and I never actually kind of understood where that came from. I think it's honestly just practice, but also schooling, like a lot of schoolwork while learning kind of like AP style from a more boring side of journalism is also just talking to people and interviewing people. And I think if you do something so much, you're eventually just going to learn how to do it well, or do it well enough that people want to watch your interviews. And so I don't think anyone starts out doing anything particularly well. And if you go into kind of the space with the idea that you're going to be, the next whichever content creator you aspire to be, it's not going to happen. At least not the way you expect it to, is probably the best way to put that. But I think that it is important to kind of find your role in the space, your niche in the space, for sure. Because there's 1,000 people that play video games, but there's only one Dr. Disrespect, right? Like there's only one guy that can kind of keep up that persona, and people have tried to imitate that, and it just never really worked out.
Yeah.
So finding your like uniqueness, and almost anything that you do is super important.
Yeah. Absolutely. I will say, when I was back, over 7 years ago, and we did our first interview, I was this kind of young hotshot that was on top of the world, competing professionally.
Oh yeah.
I felt
you had some bravado to you for sure.
Yeah. But I felt really taken care of because we had a really deep conversation. It was called Real Talk. Right. And I just want to, give kudos to you, because way back then, I'm sure you've gotten even better, over the years, but I felt really taken care of, and I felt comfortable going into my story in a way in which very few interviews I've ever done made me feel that way. So
that's awesome. Yeah. It's Real Talk's one of those shows that over the past, I stopped doing it, unfortunately. A lot of the shows that I do now do kind of have facets of interviews. But in the past like year or so, I've definitely had thoughts, and I have like a full graphics package ready to go if I ever decide to go and do the show. It's just honestly like, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of work went into those episodes. I mean, I don't know how long our episode was ultimately, but some of those were like 2 to 3 hour long.
Oh yeah, it was a couple of hours sessions. For sure.
Yeah, and like the prep for that, I think nowadays I'm much more lackadaisical in it, and I can just like go into an interview and talk about whatever. Those shows were so scripted out and so like planned ahead of time, that a 3 hour recording, which was a lot, was 20 to 25 hours of prep. Looking at different stories that you had, different interviews that you had already done, different things that you had said, different comments that you had tweeted out and never really followed up on, that type of stuff. Like doing the groundwork for that type of stuff is super important, I think, for interviews. And so I haven't done it in a while. I also think Real Talk in 2020 is a terrible name.
Yeah.
I think it's an awful name for a show. So I might rebrand.
Well, actually, there is that. What's that? I'm trying to think. Will Smith and their family did a.
Oh, did they have like an Instagram show or something?
Yeah, no, it's a Facebook show. Then it was called Table Talk or something like that. I can't remember. It was like it's something like that. But it was along the same lines of Real Talk.
Yeah.
It did well, not gaming, but it's doing well apparently.
Sure. There's a lot of like insert word here talk.
Yeah.
Right. Naming a show, especially these days, I think is unbelievably hard.
Yeah.
Because there's so many, you can go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever, and there's just so many different shows out there. And it's hard to like actually get good names for stuff, but that's besides all the point. So content always is best. Name is whatever. Doesn't matter.
Content's king. When you were in those early days, you mentioned like you were getting your foot in the door and not getting paid. You were doing grunt work. You started the podcast. What were some of the challenges that you faced around that time?
I think challenges were just like not knowing where to go and what to do. Um, I think resources like your content that we're doing right now are super valuable, and that stuff is a great way to dip your toes in and see if it's something that you're interested in. Back then, that stuff didn't really exist. The idea of like um, downloading OBS and learning how to local record, or learning how to manipulate OBS in the first place, or even setting up a microphone so that you can record it plus video plus audio. All that stuff didn't exist. There was no tutorials for that. You kind of had to figure it out on your own. And then eventually the content became, how do you do all this type of stuff? So that was there for a couple of years, and I think that's even there. That's even somewhat of a hurdle today, where there's just not that much resources for it. Some of the initial hurdles were definitely like, how do I do this? I think also like, what do I do? Had I not found Gotfrag and made those connections there, I think two things. One, I wouldn't have recognized or realized how important connections are in any industry. I think specifically in kind of the gaming and the esports industry, a lot of success is based around like who you know and who you can kind of get to vouch for you to get your foot in the door. And that's definitely, when I finally got a full-time job at MLG, the people that I knew were my relationships at Gotfrag, Lee Chen and Scott Smith, Scoots, who's still out there today and in the esports
At least
world.
he's still alive. For Scott.
Yeah. And 70s or not? No, he's not. But yeah, like people like that who definitely like vouched for me. Had I not had that, I think the industry at that time was very much who you knew, and I think that might even be more true these days. I'm kind of, I'd say I'm pretty removed from esports nowadays, but I think almost all industries are who you know, and kind of not necessarily how you can get them to help you, but how you can put the spotlight on yourself so that those people want to help you, right? And how they want to help you succeed. Um, but yeah, I think other problems like tech, in terms of what was available. I necessarily didn't have income back then. So I had a computer, and that was it wasn't the top of the line computer. I had to kind of put pieces together in terms of, got a microphone that sounded halfway decent. Back then, this was 2010, so it was probably a Yeti, which I think is a lot of people's entry mic back then. I got a camera, C920, the Logitech, still kind of like the go-to camera, I think, these days, which is funny that's the tried and true camera after.
It's built a reputation.
Yeah, 11, 12 years, something like that. They've actually tried to improve on it with like the C930. It's actually worse.
Yeah, and the other, is it the Brio?
Yeah, the Brio's bad too.
Yeah.
The Brio is like a worse camera somehow than that C920. They struck gold with it.
Yeah.
And they tried to like improve it, I think the Brio might be 4K or can record in 4K or something like that. Yeah, just get a C920. That's my advice on that. But yeah, it's just all the different, all the different tech and all that type of stuff. I think the standardization of that didn't exist yet. So it was kind of trying to find stuff that worked for sure.
As you were starting to find your footing, there's like the frustrations of you mentioned your equipment, you're not getting paid that much.
If anything at all, really.
Versus the high of like what you were doing. How did those stack up? Were you like, I don't care about all this other stuff I deal with. I'm so high. I'm doing something I'm passionate about, or like, how did it stack up for you?
I think initially it was the idea of being able to create content and find something that I was interested in back then, trumped almost everything. Luckily I was in college and I was on scholarship, and my parents also, were able to pay for college. So, or at least enough to where I could go. I of course had to pay all those loans back later down the line. But it was honestly like, I didn't know what I wanted to do full time, and I didn't know at the time that could ever be a job. Because I essentially, until I got the job at MLG, there was probably maybe like a couple $100 over 2 years or 3 years of actual like doing things in terms of weekly, probably 20 to 30 hours of score grunt stuff, shows and podcasts, probably 15 to 20 hours. It was definitely like a passion project.
Yeah.
right out of the gate. And kind of like you said, the high of creating all that stuff. It was awesome when I was doing it. It was more fun to see people react to it and the term and sense of like watching it. Back then, not that much stuff was live. Twitch wasn't really a big deal until kind of 2011, 2012 when I started doing StarCraft stuff. But for ArenaCast, it was more like, oh man, we had tracking was a nebulous thing back then. So there were reports for a couple people that I was using their hosting. Again, it was who you knew. So the people that I worked with was actually Sean Fanning, who was Napster, the creator of Napster. One of his friends had a bunch of hosted, just like allowed me to throw MP3s on there. And so that's where we hosted ArenaCast. But we didn't have any sense of analytics back then. So every once in a while I would hear like, hey, your show got, 15,000 hits. And that was like a number that just blew my mind.
Yeah. Blew anyone's mind.
But I didn't know, and I still don't know really like if that was for every episode or one episode, or I didn't know what that number meant.
Yeah.
But it was a big enough like high. It was like, hey, you have 15,000 people or 15,000 instances of someone listening to the show. And that was kind of like a holy shit type moment for me. And I think as that kind of started to progress forward, especially when I started doing a bunch of StarCraft content with like state of the game and everything, seeing more and more people watch that stuff. I think I think any content creator, when you first start out, seeing numbers like that, especially if they're constantly rising, that is in itself like one of the purest highs.
Yeah, it is. You can complete drug.
Yeah. Because and the alternative is when you start to see that go the other way, it's like super depressing.
Yeah.
And so you got to be very careful and you have to be very tempered in kind of how you take in all that information for sure.
You mentioned that break you got the 15,000. Was that the kind of defining moment for you to like go, I'm latching onto this, I'm going for it? Like, what inspired you to say, this is my career, I'm going after this? Did you get that job from MLG? What was it?
I think kind of the moment where I realized that it was going to be a real deal. I think it might have been when I got the full-time job, or when I was told that I was going to be given like a full-time contract from MLG. I don't remember. I think I flew from San Antonio to Indianapolis, and MLG was doing I forgot the branding for it. It was a college StarCraft 2 tournament. And I shoutcasted that with Kevin Naki, who used to work at IPL, and I think worked at IGN after that. That was his first gig ever, I think, at least on that scale. And I was kind of going in there as, like I guess the MLG guy, the suit, as it were. And I remember I had dinner that night. They gave me my own hotel room, which was the first time that has ever happened. And then I had dinner that night with Lee Chin, who was, I think, a senior VP at that time at MLG. And he, was like, hey, you've been really kicking ass lately. We'd love for you to come out to New York and kind of see the offices. And we'd also like to, offer you a contract in. And I think at that moment, it was like, all right, I guess this is what I'm going to do. I guess this is kind of where I'm headed. And it was also, I think, another turning point when I finally made it out to New York and spent about a month out there in an apartment that MLG had rented for that month to see how I would like it. They kind of gave me a test run. It was at that point where I realized I hate New York and I can't actually do this. Being in Texas and growing up in Texas, it's all wide open space. New York is a concrete jungle. And so it just didn't fit within, it didn't fit with me being raised in Texas for 20 plus years. So that was, one of those things where it's like, hey, I'd love to continue working with you guys. And I hope that you continue working with me. I can't do New York. So let's try to figure out something else. And luckily they were able to. But I think that initial conversation in Indianapolis was where I finally realized, like, all right, let's go down this path. Let's see how this goes. I'd already graduated from college. I think I was probably 4 or 5 months out of college at that point. And so I had to make a
I'd love
decision
to put
to figure
some
it all out.
context setting around that, because this is a number of years in. How many years from that initial podcast that you created way back when, the Quake days, to now, or to this point at MLG, where you're like, this is a career?
I want to say that it was definitely when StarCraft 2 was out. So when it's let me Google real quick. Pardon the typing here. StarCraft 2 launch. That launched July 27th, 2010, is when Wings of Liberty launched. And so I remember that launch because that was also the day 9 launch party that I shoutcasted with him when he did that out of a college auditorium. And that was definitely, one of those events where it's like, all right, maybe this can turn into a thing. There was a lot of like lead up events. They were like, all right, maybe this will turn into something. Because it was a live studio audience. We were live on the internet. We had, 10,000 plus people, but it wasn't necessarily something that was like, hey, you're going to get a lot of money from this. It was like, hey, would you like to come out and be on this thing and shoutcast this thing? Cool. Yeah, I'm in. Let's go. I'll get a flight out there. Great. Cool. There was never any conversation of like, you'll be paid this much. That was never a conversation. And I think that was never a conversation for a while. But I think there was probably 3 to 4 years before I ever kind of saw a real job, a real source of income for that stuff. To kind of answer your question, I think.
That's a while.
For sure. Yeah.
Did you have an SO, or did you have a family that was looking at you going, what are you doing at this point in time? Or were you like your own man, you were off to do your own thing?
It was definitely, if I was still living at home when all that happened. And I think, my parents were kind of just like, graduated from college, you're doing this stuff. Is this going to work out? And, I think they had that in the back of their minds. To me, openly, they were always just like, yeah, that's awesome. Keep doing that stuff. We'll support you as much as we can. And I think that, like, I'm very privileged and very lucky to be able to have a family that supported me in that way. I think if I didn't have that, I probably would have been much more annoying to everyone else that I worked for, because the idea of, hey, is there money involved in this, would have came up a lot more.
Yep.
The fact that I didn't necessarily need that paycheck because I could, go back home and I would have food and, place to live and all that type of stuff. That was definitely something that was always there for me, which is a huge, huge boon to have. And I'm super privileged, like I said, to have had that. I think right around the time, I don't necessarily know how long, but it definitely was like, hey, great, you got a job. By the way, you have all this college debt that we need you to pay off.
Now that you're a man.
Now that you've actually got a real job, can you start making some monthly payments on that stuff? And that was kind of where I think for a while I was sheltered and like not necessarily aware of, the world and how it worked at that time. That when that paycheck first started coming in, it was like, I have a lot. Like I bought a bed. I remember the first thing I ever bought from my first paycheck from LG was like, I bought myself my own bed. It's like, this is great. Like, this is an awesome bed. This is super cool. And then I looked at the rest of the paycheck and there was not much left. And my parents were like, hey, you got these college loans. Eventually after that, I had to start paying rent because I moved to Galveston, Texas for a studio there that MLG opened up. That they were kind of, there was a lot of back and forth, like, hey, we'll pay the rent for this amount of time. Then it didn't actually really work out. So then I had to start paying like half the rent and blah, 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 blah. But it was, luckily for me, it was a slow process of like, you can learn how to be an adult slowly, not you can learn how to be an adult like right now at this particular moment, or you're not going to, survive.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm very lucky to have been that sheltered and that helped out along the way, for sure.
Did you ever think at any point, not just at that point, but in the last, 10 years, about giving it up for a real job?
I've often thought what I would be able to do if I didn't do what I currently do. And I don't know what that would be. It would probably be like a radio DJ, or I don't know. The idea of teaching is something that's always interested me. That's not like obviously a high paying job, but I think the reward, like the moral reward there is super high. Being able to kind of impart wisdom to people that are interested in what you're trying to teach. There's something about that I think I would really enjoy. Um, and I think in some of my content, that type of stuff existed already or exist already. Um, but luckily, I haven't had any real hard consequences of like, hey, you need to get a real job or you need to get a different job.
Yeah, that's what I was going to catch myself. I was going to say, real job because it absolutely is a real job. But
it is a real job, yeah. But back then it wasn't, right? Like it was in the early 2010, 2011 era. You could go to someone and they'd ask, I remember constantly being on a plane and it was conversations like, what do you do for a living? And most of the time I would just lie because I didn't actually want to try to explain to them like, oh, I work for this company that has an office in New York and New York's pretty big. Yeah. So what do they do? Well, we StarCraft, what like video games, we basically commentate people that play these games for a living. And then I would usually get like mixed results where the person would either like stop talking to me or they'd want to know more. They want to know like how, like where the money actually comes from in that. So then I had to like go down the path of learning how CPM works and how like ad rates work and all that nonsense. But yeah, back then it definitely wasn't a real job. I think today, obviously it is. But back then in the early 2000s or 2010, 2011, 2012-ish, no one was making a killing from this. No one was really making, especially not making what they are today.
Oh yeah.
It was so much smaller. And I think there was so much because of that and kind of a weird and gross way, there was so much more passion and all of that type of stuff. It wasn't people chasing the money. They were chasing the idea of trying to grow it as big as possible. Something that they were super into and the sport that they were into and the things that they did. They wanted that to be, the biggest thing possible. Nowadays, it's kind of like how much money can I
don't want to go off on a tangent, but it's an interesting point. Do you think that's because we're older and more bitter? Or is it because like that's actually true and it's happening? Because like are the younger kids today, they're thinking like I'm just curious.
I think back then money was just not talked about. And I think today it's so much, if you go to a Twitch stream, everyone knows generally what a sub is worth to a streamer for the most part. And everyone knows loosely what like a sponsor means to someone. And there's enough information out there where someone can look at something in the space and know the amount of revenue that's going to generate for the most part. I mean, you can Google that stuff and you'll get varied reports. And there's always, those the websites where it's like, what is the net worth of blah, blah, blah? Oh, that person makes 30 million a year. There's no way that's anywhere close to what they actually make. But it's still a number, right? So I think people see that and they get the allure of like, oh man, it'd be amazing to be playing Call of Duty right now and making millions and millions of dollars doing it. Back then it was just like, wait a minute, I have 1,000 people watching me play StarCraft right now. Like what? That's 1,000 people. Like and back then that was a huge number. Yep. Nowadays it's like 100,000, right? That's kind of the comparison. So I think that there is some sort of bitterness, and I think that there is definitely money kind of everywhere being a large factor. But I still think passion drives a lot of it. Yesterday I was watching Courage on YouTube doing the charity drive, and he raised like $500,000 for the COVID relief fund or something like that. That's something that comes from passion, 100%. He doesn't get a cut of that charity revenue.
Yeah.
He gets promotion and all that stuff, but he's doing that 100% to raise money, right? So there's still passion around the industry for sure. You just have to find it.
Yeah. Is there anything in the last decade that you feel you made a mistake on that you wish you didn't, or that you learned a lot from?
I think mistakes are how you learn. I think mistakes are going to happen, and they definitely did happen with me. I think I tried to, in some cases, I tried to be too, like that. That's a mistake. I tried to be too professional in the sense of like from a legal standpoint, um, in terms of like forming LLCs and all that type of stuff. I think that you can definitely go that route, but you have to kind of remain true to who you are and kind of keep that creativity alive, as it were. Um, but mistakes happen. You learn from them. And I think if those mistakes didn't happen, I wouldn't be where I am today. And luckily, I have been able to kind of be introspective and learn on them, and also surround myself with people that say, "Hey, that wasn't a good thing. You should probably not do that again, or probably not do it that way." And they've corrected me. So I've been very fortunate to be able to have those type of people around me for sure.
That's a really good point. Just having people around you. I can even attest myself in the past. When you're on that high and there's ego that gets into play, and you start to kind of develop this ego, and like it's really a bad thing.
Yeah.
No matter what stage you're at, it's
I think in the esports days, I definitely had the ego, like you said. And I think in esports, it's so easy to get a giant ego. I think in some sense you have to have an ego for any sense of type of content creation, because the only way that you can kind of learn, like I said, is from other people commenting on stuff. That's the best way to kind of filter or start to create a filter to make good content, right? But that ego can definitely get away from you. And I think for a large portion towards the end of kind of my esports career, as it were, I had a massive ego. And luckily, I had friends that kind of chopped that apart. Total Biscuit, John Bain,
Yep.
was one of those people. When I quit MLG, he was there. I was basically there's. I remember it was around Christmas, and it was about 3 months stint where I just didn't create anything. We didn't do an episode of State of Game. I just didn't put any content out. I was kind of living on savings from MLG. And I remember getting a text from him or a DM on Twitter, whatever it was. And he basically said, like, hey, you need to fucking do something. Like, you're just wasting time right now.
That's
Make something.
So good.
Yeah. And at the time, the ego was still there. So my initial response was like, fuck you, dude. Like, who are you to tell me this stuff?
Chills.
But 6 months after the fact, it was like, no, you're right. And that's when I started role play, which was the D&D stuff. And that was kind of the next, I guess, area that I kind of started to go into for sure. And that was probably the most, probably one of the bigger moments for sure in the career that kind of went down another path that I never would have expected.
That's where I wanted to go to next, was when you're thinking about your evolution of your content. So not necessarily your career, but your content. Moving out of esports was probably a pretty big decision. How did you realize that was the right call for you?
Yeah, so that circled back to that conversation of MLG wanting me to go to New York. They kind of put their foot down and said, like, look, this Galveston thing is not working. You're making great content out there in terms of the stuff that you're producing out of essentially your living room is what it was. But if you were here in New York, we've got the studio space. We're doing MLG arenas almost every other month, and we're doing our normal MLG events. We really need you up here. We can make so much more content. You could also do your shows from our studio. It'd be a great time. And so I had to, they said, take a week, I think it was about a week or so, figure it out. Like, let us know the answer. We're cool with whichever way you go. No hard feelings if you decide to go the other way, but just let us know. And so I sat there for a week and thought about it. I didn't stream during that entire time. I talked it over with a bunch of friends, and it was honestly like, it was, I think that there's another universe where I went down that esports path, right? Where I stayed with MLG, and I would have, I guess, ended up at Blizzard doing something when they eventually sold. Which still, even saying that, I had to think if I actually said that correctly. I still can't believe that they went to Blizzard. But anyways, that's a whole nother conversation. So yeah, it was that. I took that week, and I remember I had 2 or 3 calls with Sundance, who was the CEO of MLG. They were just like, hey, how are you feeling? Where's your head at right now? And we went back and forth, and there was a lot of money on the table. They put up a very nice contract that I would have been able to, live in New York and not have to worry about making ends meet, so to speak. But ultimately, I decided not to. I decided to go back and I stayed in Galveston. for another, I think, month, and then ended up moving to Dallas with a friend that I grew up playing Quake. He had a house, had a couple empty rooms. Said, yeah, you can stay here. Um, I won't ask for money or anything for the first couple months to kind of figure something out. And that was around the time that John messaged me and I started role play. But that was definitely a big deciding point of I had no idea what I was going to do. And luckily I started, streaming stuff on Twitch, and it necessarily wasn't lucrative at all. It wasn't until we started doing the role play stuff that it really became kind of, like I said, the next big thing for sure.
And I find that fascinating because this is a relatively young industry, and it's a real young industry. And you've reinvented yourself almost at least twice, but probably three times now, in different aspects.
Sure.
And how do you find that period of reinventing yourself? Is it a hard thing to do, or is it just happens because it kind of subtly starts going that way?
I don't know what I contribute it to. I think in content creation, I think in life, there's luck. It's associated with everything. There's ways to take luck and turn it into calculated risk. And I think I would love to say that, all of that stuff was calculated, but a lot of it was just luck. I never would have imagined that someone that played StarCraft 2 would go in and start, casting that, shot casting that, and then leave esports to start playing D&D and make that their living. Let alone the fact that the people that I was doing the show with at the time were also from the esports world. Um, Jeff in Control was one of them. Another one, Jen, who I was dating at the time when we started the show. Ryan, who was a tournament admin at MLG. And then Neil Erickson, who still does stuff today. And so does Jen in the D&D world, who we kind of just found randomly. I think he ran a website called SC2 Reports or something like that, which was a replay tool that just hosted replays. And he just happened to be following Jeff or following me or something. And, we started a show and people tuned in. They were drawn by kind of Jeff's personality, I think was probably the biggest allure there. And it just ended up working out. Um, there's no reason that should have worked out.
Yeah.
It just ended up working out.
How much do you think it was about being with your buddies?
I think that is definitely something that was true, or that is true. I think most of if you kind of look back at all the big, like troops that exist on content creation, most of those, they were not big content creators individually. They came up as a group and they were friends first and foremost. Um, and that was why people watched them, because they wanted to be a part of that friend group, right? It wasn't like the idea that I think it is now. And I think for some part, it's not necessarily true, but you can be a purely individual streamer these days. You don't necessarily have to run with kind of a group. It totally is in your interest to find like-minded people that you're into playing video games with or into doing things with, from a content creation standpoint, but it's not necessary. I think back then, especially with role play, people liked watching the initial cast for what it was, and that was just 5 friends who were able to play D&D together once a week. They wanted to be at that table. They wanted to see what was going to happen, for sure.
Yeah, I think having friends would definitely save, from my experience as well. Just having them with you on that journey is incredibly important because there's so many ups and downs. And having John or Total Biscuit reach out and just put that fire up your ass when you needed it,
Yeah,
I think is a testament to a good friend.
without a doubt. Yeah, John was kind of the one that, and he did this for a lot of different content creators. A lot of people kind of came up off of his back, and springboarded into the world of content creation. And he was the one that was helping them springboard. He was doing a lot of the lifting. It wasn't that people were using him. He was putting his friends first and foremost in a lot of those situations. I think I was on Co-optional, his podcast that he did with Jesse and Dodger 4, maybe 5 times throughout, its stint as a show, when John was at the helm there. And every time I went on, I was nervous. I made sure that I was super attentive. I made sure that I was always present in the show. And that just had that boiled down to the respect that I had for John and the respect that I had for the show. And I think finding, if possible, kind of finding those people is super important, like you were saying. But it's very hard these days because there's a lot of people that will just use someone for money.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of the state of, say, the business. And I think the evolution of business on anywhere that's not necessarily esports. That's everything.
Yeah,
So
I think the
you gotta be
incentives, to your point earlier about passion, the incentives are definitely a little different now than they were maybe back then.
Yeah.
When you think about your content now, what's lighting you up? What gets JP excited? What are you looking forward to? Obviously, this year's a little wild.
Yeah.
But what are you looking forward to in terms of your content?
I think right now we've definitely started. I say we because we're my company is more. I say company because we actually have people that work for me now. In terms of like stream and all that, we're definitely more interested in kind of games in general, but also just kind of talking to people. I'm kind of getting back into the idea of, like I said, interviewing and that type of stuff. I still haven't pulled the gun on that yet, but we started up a new show. We're on episode, I think 4 coming up next Friday, called The Pre-Show, which is really probably the lowest amount of work I've ever done for a show, but it's one of my favorite shows to do. It's 2 hours with no topics, except we can't talk about games. And I just talk to people.
Oh, I love that concept, JP.
We've done 3 shows so far. The first show had DJ Wheat and 2 people that I did a bunch of D&D stuff with. Who to have on the set? Oh, second show was a bunch of like gaming focused people. We had community manager for Warframe on the show, Morgan Webb from G4. We've had her on a bunch of our role play stuff. So we had her on there. And then Rami Ismail, who's a big indie game developer. And we just, talked to them about things that weren't work. And I think the reason that I enjoy this, then the most recent episode we had, now I'm blanking on who we had. Oh, we had Dodger and Jesse again from the Co-optional podcast. But yeah, the thing that I'm most enjoying now, you spoke about kind of the world and in lieu of the COVID virus, is honestly just talking to people. Like it's one of the best things I tell people now that are having a hard time with it is just call someone, call a family member, call your parents, call whoever, and just say, hey, can we just talk about anything for a bit? Yeah. And it's like one of the best practices. And so that's essentially what the show is just me filming that process and then just talking to people about stuff. We have a future show with Day 9, DJ Wheat, and Shocks coming up. I haven't done, I think this might actually be the first time I've ever actually done any sort of content with Shocks. So I'm very interested in talking with her. And then, Sean will just be there as the laugh track, and DJ Wheat will be the one that's making the insightful comments. So I'm very much looking forward to that show.
I'm going to check it out. I can't wait personally as a fan of, I haven't followed your content a lot over the recent years, but for me as a fan, it's super exciting to hear you return back to more interview style, because I remember it was a big part of my career growing up. I looked at all of your interviews across StarCraft, Dota, League, as inspiration for me in my career, because a lot of those folks were actually further ahead than I was. And I wanted to know how they were handling it. Like I remember the one with Idra and all that. And it's super cool to hear you going back to that format, because I think you are genuinely one of, if not the best, interviewers in our space.
Thank you, man. That means a lot.
And I
appreciate that.
It's so good. We're at time, JP, but I want everyone to know where they can go find you, especially catch this next episode with the crew. Where can they go find you if they want to go check you out?
Sure. The best place for kind of everything that I do is my Twitter, twitter.com/itmeJP, itmeJP, no S, or my Twitch, twitch.tv/itmeJP. We've got a bunch of different shows popping up over the next couple of weeks. Tomorrow, as I was kind of mentioning to you before we got started, I was supposed to get married. I was supposed to be walking down the aisle tomorrow. But in lieu of that, because we're not doing it because of the COVID virus, we're going to do like a baking stream. So
that's so rad.
Immediately after this, I have to go set up an entire production in the kitchen. So we're blowing it completely out of proportion. We've got 4 cameras that are all, controlled by remote control and an ultra wide monitor that I'm setting up and a bunch of mics. And I kind of geek out whenever I can do that type of stuff. And my fiance knows that I geek out. So that's why she's kind of allowing it all. So that's tomorrow here on, I'm not sure when this is going out to the public, but this will be on the 25th of April. We'll have VODs for that. The show that I mentioned to you earlier is the pre-show. The show with Day 9, Shocks, and Wheat will be on May the 4th at 4 p.m. Eastern. We're doing another show with Jericho and Ammunition on May the 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern. We've got episodes that drop frames every Wednesday, role play episodes every Thursday, and then I stream every single day at 1 p.m. Eastern. So
cool.
A lot of stuff, a lot of ways to catch me.
You all heard it. Go check him out. I promise you won't be disappointed. Honestly, one of the most amazing personalities in the space, and been around for a long time. He's seen everything, the full gambit. JP, all the best tomorrow. I didn't have a big day for our wedding, and it was absolutely incredible and the best decision I've ever made in my life. So a massive congrats to you. I'm super happy for you both.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Take care.